So think about if you break your arm, right?
Yeah.
You go to the doctor, they take an x-ray, and there it is. Just a clean, jagged white line on the screen. It's either broken or it's not broken.
It's very binary.
Exactly. The truth is totally visible. And honestly, it's comforting, you know? We
Yeah.
naturally expect that exact same level of precision when we look at, like, large-scale scientific data or clinical trials or public health policy.
But that's where the comfort ends, unfortunately.
Right, because what happens when the x-ray machine itself is rigged? What happens when you step into the world of statistical modeling and prestige medical journals and you suddenly realize that the landscape of truth is, well, it's entirely engineered.
You realize you are swimming in some very diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, that comforting illusion of the binary X-ray vanishes completely.
It really does.
It gets replaced by this incredibly sophisticated architecture of persuasion.
And navigating that architecture is exactly what we are doing today. So, welcome back to the deep dive. We are so glad you're joining us today.
Okay, let's unpack this because our mission today is pretty ambitious.
It's a big one.
Yeah, we are tracing the evolution of a concept called sophistry. We're going to track how the art of intellectual deception mutated from, the sunlit public squares of ancient Greece all the way into the hallowed halls of modern scientific journals.
And eventually, right into the humming server rooms of artificial intelligence.
Exactly. And by the time we finish this deep dive, the goal is for you, the listener, to walk away with a very specific toolkit. We want you to have the ability to spot deception when it's wearing the pristine disguise of objective truth.
Because it's a fascinating trajectory to map out. I mean, we're looking at how the technology of persuasion has radically evolved from spoken rhetoric to complex epidemiology, but human psychology hasn't changed at all.
Right. Our vulnerabilities are exactly the same as they were thousands of years ago.
So we are pulling from a really eclectic stack of sources today to build this map. We're looking at ancient texts, specifically excerpts from Plato's dialogues, the Sophist, and the Theatrics.
Some foundational philosophy there.
Yeah, but then we're jumping to modern critiques of major epidemiological studies. Like there's a recent New England Journal of Medicine study on veterans and COVID-19 vaccines we're looking at.
And that University of Wisconsin-Madison study on premature births, which is fascinating.
Right. Plus, we're diving into whistleblower accounts from pharmaceutical trials, philosophical dialogues on immune memory, and this truly mind-bending paper from Embo Reports that looks at large language models, AI chatbots as digital sophists.
It bridges thousands of years of human thought. But the through line connecting ancient Athens to modern server farms is, well, it's incredibly consistent.
It really is. But before we take a single step further, we need to just pause for a second.
Yes, very important.
You, the listener, need to hear this disclaimer loud and clear, because the documents and the critiques we are analyzing today contain some highly charged, heavily debated content regarding COVID-19 vaccines, trial integrity, and government health policies.
We have to establish the ground rules for this deep dive.
Exactly. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing and we are not condemning any political, medical, or institutional viewpoints today.
Right. Our job here is strictly impartially reporting on the arguments.
Just the logic and the ideas exactly as they are presented in these original source documents. We are looking at this exclusively through the lens of rhetoric and data manipulation.
We are studying the mechanics of the arguments. We're not trying to declare a victor in the culture wars.
Couldn't have said it better. Our focus is entirely on how information is structured, how uncertainty is handled, and, how language is deployed to create consensus, regardless of the underlying politics. So, with that firmly established, let's travel back to ancient Athens. Because to understand the modern illusion, we have to define the original concept. What exactly is sophistry?
In the simplest terms, sophistry is the use of fallacious, clever, highly persuasive arguments with the specific intention to deceive or manipulate.
Right. It sounds brilliant, it feels logical, but at its core, it's a trick.
And to truly grasp the mechanics of that trick, we have to look at Plato's Great Divide. In the text we're reviewing, especially Plato's dialogue, The Sophist, he draws this razor-sharp contrast between two figures in society, the philosopher and the sophist.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the genuine philosopher is portrayed as someone fundamentally dedicated to the pursuit of objective truth and reality. They are trying to pierce through the illusions of the physical world to see what is actually there.
Even if that truth is really uncomfortable.
Exactly, regardless of the discomfort.
Yeah.
But the sophist, well, Plato is just ruthless when describing the sophist.
He really is. He goes in hard.
He describes the sophist as an imitator, a juggler, and an image maker. And what's fascinating here is the epistemological distinction Plato makes. The sophist isn't concerned with what is real. They are concerned entirely with what appears to be real.
Or what a crowd can be convinced is real.
Right. They are masters of the appearance of wisdom.
Wait, hold on, though. Let me stop you there and push back on Plato just a little bit.
Sure.
Because were the ancient sophists actually these malicious supervillains trying to destroy truth? Or were they just, pragmatic? Weren't they just giving the market exactly what it wanted?
That's a very fair question.
Because if you look at Socrates, who is Plato's mouthpiece in these texts, Socrates uses this incredible analogy in the Theatrics. He calls himself a midwife.
Yes, the famous midwife of ideas.
Right. Socrates says he is actually barren of wisdom himself. He claims he cannot just hand you a pre-packaged truth.
He has to help you give birth to it.
Exactly. His method, the Socratic method of constantly asking questions and dismantling your assumptions, it's designed to help you give birth to your own ideas. And he tests those ideas to see if they are real or just wind eggs, as he calls them.
Which is agonizing work for the student.
It is. It requires the student to struggle, to admit absolute ignorance, to experience what Socrates calls the dizziness of not knowing.
It requires an ego death, really.
Yes. But the sophist rolls into town, looks at the wealthy young men, and says, hey, don't worry about the hard work. I have a golden dream of wisdom right here.
Right.
Pay me, and I'll give you the exact arguments you need to sound brilliant and win every debate.
That is a brilliant distillation of the dynamic. You've hit on the exact motivation of the ancient sophist. They were merchants of persuasion.
Merchants of persuasion. I love that.
Yeah, in the text, Plato literally categorizes them as a money-making class. He calls them paid hunters of the young and wealthy.
Wow. Paid hunters.
You have to remember the context of ancient Athens. It was a nascent, highly litigious democracy. Your political power, your legal survival if you were sued, your social standing, it all depended entirely on your ability to persuade a crowd of citizens or a jury of your peers.
So if you could speak well, you basically ruled the city.
Exactly. So the sophists sold a highly valuable, tangible commodity, the technical skill to win arguments, regardless of the underlying factual truth.
They were hired tutors.
Right. They taught young noblemen how to argue any side of an issue with equal passion. They weren't seeking universal philosophical knowledge. They were seeking practical, socio-political utility. They were selling influence.
And Plato points out how deeply dangerous that is to a society because human beings are already so prone to self-deception.
Oh, absolutely.
Like in the Theatrics, there are these two beautiful metaphors about memory and false opinion. First, Socrates talks about the mind as a block of wax.
The wax tablet, where experiences leave an imprint.
Right, but he says the quality of the wax varies from person to person. Sometimes the wax is too hard, so the imprint of reality is shallow and easily wiped away.
Or it's too soft.
Yeah, and the impressions just melt together into a confused blur. Or the wax is impure, filled with dirt, so the memory gets distorted. He's basically saying our baseline grasp on reality is already incredibly fragile.
And then he expands on that fragility with the aviary metaphor, which is even more profound, I think.
Yes, I love the aviary metaphor. Imagine your mind is this enormous, dark room filled with birds flying around. Every bird represents a piece of knowledge or a fact you've learned.
Right.
So when you try to remember something, you reach into the dark aviary to grab a specific bird, but it's chaotic in there. Sometimes you reach in to grab the bird that represents the number 12, but you accidentally grab the bird that represents the number 11.
You mistake one truth for another.
Exactly. It's just an innocent mistake of a fallible human mind.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sophist weaponizes that dark aviary. They don't just accidentally grab the wrong bird.
What do?
The sophist reaches in, grabs a common pigeon, meticulously paints it gold, and then proudly displays it to the crowd, swearing up and down that it's a rare, majestic eagle.
Oh, wow.
They operate in the space of what Plato calls interchanged opinion, where they deliberately use the ambiguity of language and the fallibility of human memory to make the false seem undeniably true.
Okay, so that is the ancient route, the merchant of persuasion selling a golden pigeon for power and money. But the sophists didn't just fade away when the Roman Empire rolled in, right?
Not at all. They just mutated.
Right. The modern sophists didn't disappear. They just swapped their ancient robes for lab coats, public relations firms, and peer-reviewed academic abstract.
This is a critical transition in our map, because the currency of ultimate societal authority has shifted. In ancient Athens, the ultimate authority was rhetorical dominance or, religious piety.
Sure.
Today, The unquestioned ultimate currency of truth in our society is science.
Which brings us to a really thought-provoking transcript we are analyzing today between two individuals, Mike and Joe. It's a dialogue that explores the modern public's faith in science, and it forces us to kind of look in the mirror.
It really does.
Mike points out something that feels a bit uncomfortable. He says most of the general public accepts highly complex scientific concepts not through rigorous empirical verification, but as a pure act of faith.
Just like a religion.
Exactly. It directly challenges our self-perception because we like to view ourselves as enlightened, rational actors who operate on pure data.
But we don't. I mean, Mike asks Joe, why do people believe the Earth revolves around the sun? Why do people believe in atomic theory?
And Joe has to admit it.
Right, he admits it's not because the average person out on the street has done the complex calculus or looked through a telescope to verify planetary orbit.
Or operated an electron microscope.
Exactly. They believe it because they trust the experts. They believe it because it's widely taught in schools and accepted by authority figures.
Mike references the sociologist William Graham Sumner in this dialogue, noting that popular beliefs are deeply embedded in our societal mores or folkways. We are born into a modern paradigm that implicitly tells us science is truth.
Therefore, we accept the outputs of scientific institutions largely on faith. We trust the architecture that produces the information.
And this is where modern sophistry becomes infinitely more insidious than the ancient version, don't you think?
Oh, without a doubt.
Because the ancient sophist in Athens was a known entity. They were essentially the smooth-talking corporate lawyers of their day. When they stood up to speak, you knew they were trying to persuade you. Your guard was up.
Right.
But the modern sophist cloaks their persuasion in the pristine, authoritative veneer of objective science.
The term for this is science washing.
Science washing.
Yeah, it's the practice of using the aesthetic, the specialized terminology, and the prestige of scientific institutions to launder entirely subjective arguments, economic models, or biased data into unquestionable dogma. And the danger is profound, because the defense mechanism against questioning it is already built into the culture's folkways. If you question a science-washed claim, you aren't just engaging in a Socratic debate.
What happens?
You are immediately labeled a heretic of the modern age. You are branded anti-science.
Which shuts down the Socratic method entirely. I mean, you cannot act as a midwife to new ideas. You cannot ask probing questions if the societal penalty for asking is being excommunicated from rational society.
Exactly. The modern sophist uses our implicit institutional trust as a shield against empirical scrutiny. And now, we are seeing this evolution reach a terrifying new apex with the introduction of artificial intelligence.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. One of the sources we're unpacking is this fascinating paper from MBO Reports titled The Sophist and the Server.
That's a great title.
It is. The authors argue that large language models, or LLMs, the AI chatbots we use every day, are the ultimate perfect digital sophists.
The paper makes a brilliant observation about how these models function. It notes that an LLM can articulate a highly complex, mechanistic, biological interpretation of a data set with absolute fluency.
It sounds incredibly authoritative.
It does. But if you clear the prompt and ask that exact same AI to defend the exact opposite hypothesis using the exact same data, it will do so with the exact same eloquence.
The exact same confidence.
And the exact same structural coherence.
I've actually done this. It's jarring. The AI has zero epistemic discipline.
But this raises a vital question, and the MBO Reports paper addresses it beautifully. LLMs don't invent this rhetoric in a vacuum. They don't magically know how to sound persuasive.
Right. Where do they learn it?
They are trained on our data. They are trained on petabytes of decades-old published scientific literature, grant proposals, and academic journals.
Oh, wow.
So when an LLM deploys psychological persuasion strategies, framing effects, and appeals to authority, it is simply holding a mirror up to the human researchers.
It's copying us.
It is merely echoing and amplifying the rhetorical tactics that are already deeply baked into human academic writing.
That is a deeply unsettling thought. The AI isn't inventing the deception, it's just mimicking the sophistry we've been hiding in peer-reviewed journals for years. It's just faster, untiring, and better at it.
Exactly.
Which makes me wonder, if we feed a flawed epidemiological study into an LLM, does the AI just learn that hiding adverse events is the statistically correct way to write a medical paper?
That is exactly the risk. The digital sophist learns from the human sophist.
And that leads us to the absolute core of our deep dive today. If the AI is learning from us, what exactly is the human playbook?
Let's break it down.
Yeah, how do these modern science-washing sophists actually operate in the real world? How do they rig the X-ray machine? We are going to dive into the specific methodological tricks highlighted in our source critiques, building a playbook of deception.
It's a robust playbook, too.
Let's start with the foundation. The first category is circular epistemology and metaphor as control.
Circular epistemology is a foundational tactic for the sophist. It occurs when a study, an argument, or a mathematical model embeds its own conclusion within its starting premises.
So it's rigged from the start.
Right. It assumes the very thing it is trying to prove from step one, creating a self-validating loop that precludes any real falsification.
We actually have a great visual dialogue in the sources illustrating this between person A and person B. Person A enthusiastically claims, "This medical intervention is incredible. Our models show it saves 1 million lives, so it's obviously great, even if a specific individual dies from it."
And person B plays the Socratic skeptic perfectly.
Yeah, person B catches the flaw immediately and says, "Wait, isn't that exactly what you're trying to prove? You're saying it's great because it saves lives, and you know it saves lives because you've predetermined it's great."
It is exaggerated circular reasoning. The argument literally loops back on itself to protect the premise. It acknowledges the physical reality of individual harm, like even if someone dies, but dismisses that reality as statistically irrelevant.
Because the model says otherwise.
Exactly, because the aggregate, grandiose claim of saving 1 million lives has already been accepted as an unquestionable, ultimate truth. The claim justifies itself, and therefore independent contrary evidence on the ground is never actually assessed.
And when person B pushes back, person A's defense is just a blatant appeal to popularity. They say, well, everyone says it's amazing, so it must be.
Right.
It elevates a theoretical aggregate model over individual biological reality. But this circularity isn't just found in statistical modeling, is it? It's deeply embedded in the very metaphors we use to understand biology itself.
This brings us to a profoundly interesting philosophical dialogue in our sources between two characters, Silas and Arden.
Yes, they are discussing what they call the myth of immune memory.
This is a perfect example of how language shapes and ultimately limits scientific truth. The concept of the immune system having a memory, the idea that exposure to a pathogen trains your immune system for life, like storing a file on a computer hard drive.
Right.
That is actually a 19th century metaphor.
Right. Silas points out that this metaphor, originally championed by figures like Louis Pasteur, fit perfectly with the industrial age thinking of the time. The 19th century loved machines.
So they conceptualized the immune system as machine.
It's mechanical, it's repeatable, it's measurable. It offered a clean, linear causality in what we now know is a wildly nonlinear biological system.
But Arden, the other character in the dialogue, explains why this metaphor became so incredibly entrenched in the public consciousness and in medical literature.
And it wasn't because of the science?
No, it wasn't because it was the most scientifically accurate description. In fact, modern systems biology shows it is mechanistically false. It persisted because it aligned perfectly with the goals of political modernity.
What do you mean by that?
If the immune system is merely a machine that can be programmed with an input to guarantee a lifelong output, then populations become entirely predictable. They become, as Arden says, administrable.
Administrable. Once you accept the immune system as programmable, policy writes itself. When I read that line in the source material, it blew my mind.
It's a powerful realization.
The metaphor isn't just a way for a doctor to explain science to a patient in an examining room. It's an epistemological tool for massive social governance.
Exactly. Let's look at what modern immunology actually tells us. The immune response is highly dynamic.
Yeah.
It is fiercely context-dependent.
Right.
How your body reacts to a pathogen depends on your current metabolism, the state of your microbiome, your stress levels, your circadian rhythms, and your nutritional status at the exact moment of exposure.
It's a whole ecosystem.
The system isn't remembering a static file like a computer hard drive. It is a complex ecosystem, constantly reorganizing and adapting within a state of flux.
Right, and the sources talk about original antigenic sin.
Yes, where the immune system gets trapped, reacting to the first version of a virus it saw, ignoring mutations.
Or immune exhaustion. All these phenomena prove that immunity is an ongoing biological negotiation, not a permanent, programmable switch.
But the linear 19th century metaphor has massive institutional inertia. Why? Because, as Silas says, no one in public health wants to hold a press conference and tell the public that immunity is a dynamic equilibrium dependent on 1,000 variables.
That doesn't fit on a bumper sticker.
The narrative of lifelong programmed protection is much tidier. It serves an institutional purpose. If the immune system simply remembers, then mass medical interventions become a moral certainty, a form of predictable societal programming.
The metaphor outlives the biological evidence because the metaphor promises control. That is high-level sophistry. Using a reductive, outdated metaphor to mask biological chaos because it provides socio-political utility.
And that deep institutional desire for linear control leads perfectly into our next tactic in the playbook: statistical causality and the blurring of correlation and causation.
Oh, this is a classic. This is how the modern sophist takes a messy, observed trend in the real world, just a simple correlation, and definitively attributes it to one single preferred variable.
While deliberately ignoring the massive, complex reality of confounding factors.
Right. We see this exact tactic heavily critiqued in the University of Wisconsin-Madison study on premature births, which is part of our source stack. The UW-Madison study claimed that a significant spike in premature birth was caused directly by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that this spike was subsequently halted and reversed by the introduction of vaccines.
But when I read the critique of this study, the blind spots are just staggering. Yes, there may be a statistical correlation in the timeline. The lines on the graph might move at roughly the same time. But making the definitive leap to causation ignores a mountain of real-world variables.
Let me play Socratic midwife here for a second. What about the development of natural herd immunity as the virus burned through the population over time?
Ignored.
What about massive improvements in clinical treatments for the virus itself? What about the drastic changes in prenatal healthcare practices during that period?
All ignored.
Or perhaps most significantly, what about the immense physical, psychological, and economic stress of the lockdowns themselves on pregnant women?
By entirely ignoring these massive, confounding variables, the study attributes the reduction in preterm births solely, 100%, to the vaccine.
Which is just wild.
It is a deceptive, engineered simplification. It takes a massively complex, multivariable societal and biological event and flattens it into a single variable victory for the preferred intervention.
It is the golden pigeon presented as the eagle.
Beautifully said. And we see the exact same tactic, but wrapped in much more intimidating, complex math, in the New England Journal of Medicine Veterans COVID-19 vaccine study by Kai et al.
Oh, the critique of this study in our sources is brutal. It calls the study statistical causality masquerading as biological proof.
This is a crucial concept for understanding how modern epidemiology can be weaponized. The Veterans study presents the output of a complex statistical regression model, as if it empirically confirms a mechanistic biological effect of the vaccine inside the human body.
But the critique highlights a glaring omission, doesn't it?
Yes. The study performs absolutely zero biological verification. They present no molecular data, no histologic tissue data, no blood work to prove the biological mechanism they are claiming.
Nothing physical.
Nothing. They simply equate modeled statistical associations with biological causation.
It's math pretending to be biology. It's like drawing a map of a city, pointing to a line on the map and saying, look, I proved the street is paved with asphalt. You didn't prove anything about the physical street, you just drew a line.
That's exactly what it is.
Which brings us to the third category of our playbook: selective data and the illusion of false precision. So, if the metaphors fail, and the broad correlations are easily debunked by looking at real-world confounding variables, how do these studies still get published and celebrated?
They have to hide the weak data.
And the easiest way to do that is to cherry-pick.
The critique of the Moderna mRNA 1345 RSV vaccine study illustrates this vividly. The study prominently advertised a very high efficacy rate, 83.7% against RSV-associated lower respiratory tract disease with at least 2 symptoms.
That is the headline. That is the number that gets repeated in the press releases, on the morning news shows, and by politicians.
But what gets buried on page 40 of the appendix? The adverse reactions.
Of course.
The critique notes that the study severely minimized the massive incidence of side effects. We are not talking about a sore arm for an hour. We're talking about 58.7% of the vaccinated group reporting solicited local adverse reactions compared to just 16.2% in the placebo group.
Wow.
And systemic adverse reactions, meaning effects throughout the entire body, were at 47.7% versus 32.9%. Almost half the trial participants felt systemic illness.
And furthermore, the critique points out that the study had a remarkably short follow-up period, a median of just 112 days.
Right.
Drawing definitive, sweeping conclusions about long-term safety from less than 4 months of data is highly problematic, especially considering the deeply complex known mechanisms of mRNA, lipid nanoparticles, or LNPs, which the vaccine relies on.
Right. Let's slow down and explain this, because the sources go into heavy detail about the concerns regarding LNPs, and we really need to understand the how and the why.
Yeah, what is an LNP? Let's use an analogy. Imagine lipid nanoparticles as tiny microscopic delivery trucks. Their only job is to carry the mRNA instructions and drop them off inside your cells so your body can produce the antigen.
That is their intended function, yes.
But the problem, as the critique outlines, is that these trucks don't have GPS. They are not entirely cell-specific. You inject them into the arm muscle, hoping they park there.
But they don't always park there.
No. They enter the bloodstream, traveling to various tissues and organs like the liver, the heart, the spleen, and they transfect non-target cells. They deliver the payload to the wrong address.
And the sources explicitly list the severe biological risks of this off-target delivery, including anaphylaxis and something called syncytia formation.
Syncytia formation. Break that down.
It is particularly concerning. It occurs when the cell membranes of neighboring cells fuse together, creating abnormal, giant, multinucleated structures. It essentially disrupts the fundamental cellular architecture of the tissue.
Literally cells melting together into a mutated supercell because the delivery truck crashed into the wrong building.
It's a severe issue.
By focusing almost exclusively on the short-term 83.7% efficacy percentage in the headline and deliberately burying the broad systemic reactions and the non-specific targeting dangers of LNPs deep in the fine print, the study uses selective reporting.
It presents a highly favorable but fundamentally incomplete narrative. It's the ultimate act of image-making.
But cherry-picking is almost too simple, isn't it? The most sophisticated, impenetrable way to hide weak, compromised, or selective data is through the illusion of false precision.
This is where we must look at the weaponization of confidence intervals.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully, because it gets to the very heart of how statistical rigor can be entirely faked. For the listener who isn't a statistician, what exactly is a confidence interval, or a CI? Let's explain it simply.
Statistically, a confidence interval represents a range of values within which we expect the true value of a parameter to fall, based on the sample data we collected. Imagine throwing darts at a dartboard.
Okay, I can picture that.
The confidence interval is essentially drawing a tight little circle around your cluster of darts and saying, I am 95% confident the bullseye is somewhere inside this circle.
Okay, makes sense.
So if a pharmaceutical company says their vaccine is 95% effective, with a 90% to 98% confidence interval, they're mathematically implying an incredibly high degree of certainty and reliability.
They are telling regulators and the public, we are highly confident the true, real-world effectiveness is trapped right here in this tiny, precise mathematical window.
It sounds incredibly precise. If you read that in a journal, it sounds like rock-solid, undeniable science.
But our sources tie this concept of confidence intervals directly to the explosive allegations made by whistleblower Brooke Jackson regarding the Pfizer BNT162b2 clinical trial.
Yes.
The pivotal historic trial that established that famous 95% efficacy number to begin with.
Jackson was a regional director at the Ventavia Research Group, a subcontractor conducting several sites for the Pfizer trial. The allegations she brought forward regarding the conduct at those sites were staggering.
What did she claim?
They included widespread data falsification, the use of inadequately trained staff who were actively missing or slow to follow up on severe adverse events, and perhaps most critically, the unblinding of participants.
Let's explain unblinding, because it's basically the cardinal sin of clinical trials. In a double-blind trial, neither the patient nor the doctor is supposed to know who got the real vaccine and who got the saltwater placebo.
That prevents bias.
Right. If the doctor knows you got the real shot and you complain of chest pain, the doctor might subconsciously or even consciously write it off as anxiety because they want the trial to succeed. If the blinding is broken, human bias floods the data.
Precisely. The blinding is the only thing protecting the integrity of the raw data.
So if we take Brooke Jackson's allegations, if we take her allegations, how does that relate to the complex math of a confidence interval?
It's the core issue.
If the underlying raw data at the clinic is corrupted by falsification, If untrained staff are failing to write down adverse events on the charts, and if the blinding is broken so the clinical coordinators know who got what does that tight, pristine 90% to 98% confidence interval actually mean?
It means absolutely nothing. It's a mathematical phantom. A confidence interval is an equation. It is built on the absolute fundamental assumption that the underlying trial data fed into the equation is accurate, unbiased, and collected through strict, flawless protocol.
Great.
If you input manipulated, biased, or fabricated data into a pristine statistical formula, the output is entirely meaningless. It is the classic scientific definition of garbage in, garbage out.
It reminds me of an analogy I use called the adjustment fallacy. Claiming to have a 95% confidence interval on corrupted clinical data is like taking a blurry, pixelated, corrupted photograph of a UFO and running it through a dozen high-end digital sharpening filters in Photoshop.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right, because to the untrained eye, to the public, the final image suddenly looks like a crisp, high-definition photograph. You've added precision. But the original data is still a corrupted blur. You haven't magically revealed the truth. You've just used technology to manufacture the illusion of a sharp image.
Presenting a tight confidence interval derived from compromised trial data is pure sophistry. It uses complex statistical tools to create a false sense of scientific rigor.
It's so deceptive.
It misleads regulators, doctors, and the public by masking potentially fraudulent or deeply sloppy practices behind an impenetrable veneer of mathematical certainty.
Which flows perfectly into our fourth category of deception: authority laundering, jargon, and theatrics. Let's say you've cherry-picked your data, and you've hidden your corrupted clinical trials behind a Photoshop filter of false precision. How do you get the medical community to swallow it without asking questions?
You launder it.
You launder it.
Authority laundering is a fascinating and highly effective rhetorical move. It occurs when publication in a high-prestige journal, like the New England Journal of Medicine or The Lancet, is used as rhetorical weight to substitute for actual empirical transparency.
So the brand name does the heavy lifting.
The argument essentially becomes, it is printed in the NEJM, therefore it must be unassailable truth. The prestige of the logo on the cover acts as a shield, subtly discouraging outside scientists from rigorously scrutinizing the underlying methodology.
It's just a classic argument from authority. And once it's laundered through those prestigious journals, how is the data framed for the public? Through what the critiques in our sources call relative risk theatrics.
This is perhaps the most common statistical manipulation in public health messaging, and it relies entirely on the public's misunderstanding of fractions.
Oh, this is a big one.
Let me explain the math. Imagine a new medical intervention reduces a negative outcome, say hospitalization, from 2 occurrences per 10,000 people down to 1 occurrence per 10,000 people.
Okay, so the absolute risk reduction, the actual tangible difference in reality is tiny. It's 1 in 10,000. For the vast, vast majority of people, the intervention changes nothing.
Exactly. But the relative risk reduction, the mathematical drop from 2 to 1, is 50%.
Wow.
So the modern sophist writes a press release that screams, new treatment shows a 50% reduction in hospitalizations.
It sounds massive.
It sounds urgent. It amplifies the perceived benefit to the public, wildly exaggerating the practical significance of the intervention through a deliberate theatrical choice of metric.
Imagine you're reading the morning news and the headline screams, 50% reduction in deaths. Your immediate thought is to rush out and get this treatment for your family. Right.
Of course it is.
But the article doesn't tell you that your absolute risk was basically 0 to begin with. It's technically true math used to tell a massive practical lie.
And when they aren't using loud theatrical numbers, they use soft, evasive words. The critiques identify a tactic called the linguistic dilution of uncertainty.
Linguistic dilution. Give us an example of that.
Yes, this is where study authors use incredibly soft, highly technical qualifiers, like stating, we cannot exclude residual confounding.
It functions as a confession, acting as a shield.
Precisely. By technically conceding a fatal weakness in their methodology, but doing so in highly sanitized technical phrasing buried in the discussion section, they neutralize its impact.
So they admit it, but hide it in plain sight.
They bury the uncertainty in jargon so they can maintain a rhetorical posture of overall certainty in their abstract and conclusion. They can say, well, we disclose the limitations, knowing full well the media and policymakers won't understand what residual confounding actually means.
And speaking of hiding behind jargon, we see this heavily deployed in a critique in our stack titled COVID-19 and Myocarditis, a review of literature.
That's a very telling critique.
It is. This critique argues that the published literature review selectively cherry-picks data to claim the virus causes myocarditis, while heavily downplaying or entirely ignoring the well-documented causal link between the mRNA LNPs and myocarditis. How do they hide this glaring omission?
By hiding behind highly complex medical terminology that completely obfuscates the findings from non-experts.
Exactly. They set up elaborate straw man arguments, refuting overly simplified versions of vaccine safety criticisms to artificially strengthen their pro-vaccine narrative.
They literally use the specialized language of science to build a fortress wall around their conclusions. They make it incredibly difficult for anyone without a PhD in immunology to critically assess the actual effect size or the biological importance of the findings.
The jargon is the golden paint on the pigeon.
It is.
Okay, so we've fully outlined the modern Sophists playbook, using circular, industrial-age metaphors to control policy, confusing simple correlation with absolute biological causation, hiding corrupted trial data behind the Photoshop filter of false mathematical precision, and laundering it all through prestigious journals using theatrical fractions and impenetrable jargon.
It's quite the list.
It really is. But what happens when the data, even the manipulated data, fails to persuade the public? What happens when people look at the X-ray, notice the smudge, and start asking questions? What is the modern sophist's fallback position?
That brings us to our final segment. When logic, data, and prestige fail to quell the skepticism, the modern sophist retreats to the oldest trick in the ancient Athenian playbook, the appeal to emotion.
If you can't win their minds, hijack their hearts.
Exactly. We see a prime example of this in the critique of the World Health Organization Europe study, which famously claimed that COVID-19 vaccinations saved 14.4 million lives in the region.
Wait, 14.4 million lives saved. That is a staggering, monumental number. You can't just wave that away. If a listener hears that, they're going to say, well, the WHO has the best data in the world. They must have counted the lives. How did they arrive at that number?
They didn't count them because you can't count an event that didn't happen.
What do you mean?
The critique points out that this 14.4 million number relies entirely on speculative mathematical models and what is called a counterfactual scenario.
A counterfactual.
Right. They are essentially arguing from ignorance, estimating what would have happened if vaccines didn't exist based on worst-case assumption models. It is a hypothetical alternate reality scenario that cannot be empirically proven or disproven.
So it's just a guess dressed up as a fact.
Furthermore, the critique notes the study switches interchangeably between reported COVID-19 deaths and total excess deaths whenever it strengthens their argument. In logic, this is called the fallacy of equivocation. It's a statistical bait and switch.
But the real sophistry, the real emotional hijack, is how they sell that speculative counterfactual number to the world, isn't it?
Yes.
They focus heavily in their messaging on the lower impact of vaccines in low-income countries due to inadequate access.
Which invokes a profound moral imperative. It is an argumentum ad misericordiam, an appeal to pity. Now, global health equity is undeniably an important, vital issue. But the critique argues that using highly emotional appeals about global inequality to bolster a scientifically speculative, unprovable mathematical model is a deliberate distraction.
It changes the subject entirely.
It shifts the entire debate from a rational analysis of the model's glaring limitations into a moral crusade. If you question the math of the counterfactual model, you are immediately framed as lacking compassion for low-income nations.
You aren't just mathematically wrong, you are a bad person.
Precisely.
And the emotional propaganda doesn't stop with press releases. Our sources dive deep into the broader behavioral control campaigns used over the last few years, the psychological reactance of the public, the natural Socratic human resistance to coercion and mandates, was met with intense, coordinated disinformation tactics by institutions.
Including astroturfing.
Astroturfing. For those unfamiliar, astroturfing is the practice of orchestrating fake grassroots campaigns. By using paid social media influencers, automated bot networks, and tightly coordinated institutional messaging, they create the illusion of a massive, unanimous public consensus.
It makes the individual skeptic, sitting at home looking at the data, feel entirely isolated, crazy, and marginalized.
They also utilize what intelligence agencies call a wilderness of mirrors. They pump so much conflicting information, so much hyperbole, and so much confusion into the public sphere that the actual boring, nuanced truth becomes impossible to discern.
That's a very effective tactic.
Interestingly, the sources note that institutional propagandists actually benefited from extreme, outlandish anti-vaccine narratives, like the idea that the vaccines contain microchips, They amplified those crazy theories because it allowed them to paint all skepticism with the same brush.
It's guilt by association.
Right. It made moderate, data-driven scientists who were asking legitimate questions about LNPs and confidence intervals seem unreasonable by association. They leveraged cult-like fear, focusing constantly on dire, worst-case consequences to completely bypass logic and enforce compliance.
It is the ultimate manifestation of pro-vaccine fundamentalism replacing the true scientific spirit. The foundational requirement of the scientific method is rigorous skepticism, but the public health campaign demanded unquestioning dogma.
Okay, so the landscape we've painted today is pretty bleak.
It is.
The X-ray machine is broken, the doctors are speaking in defensive riddles, the journals are laundering false precision, and the AI in our phones is learning how to lie to us perfectly by reading all of it.
It's a lot to take in.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How do you, the listener, fight back? You aren't an epidemiologist. You don't have a massive laboratory. What is your Socratic antidote to this massive multi-billion-dollar arsenal of deception?
The antidote begins with simply recognizing the architecture of the tactics we've discussed today. You must demand rigorous transparency at every level.
So question everything.
When you see a grandiose, emotionally charged claim in a headline, look for the underlying data. Cut through the jargon. If a paper is drowning in complex, multi-syllable terminology, but the core biological mechanism is vague, your guard should immediately go up. Be highly suspicious of the golden pigeon.
Reject false precision. If you find out that the foundation of a study is based on subjective phone surveys or deeply flawed trial protocols where the blind was broken, do not let them dazzle you with a 95% confidence interval.
Remember the dartboard.
Remember the Photoshop filter, garbage in, garbage out. A sharp mathematical filter does not fix a corrupt photo.
Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, we must actively embrace a concept highlighted in that MBO report's AI paper. The concept is called epistemic friction.
I love this term, epistemic friction. Break that down for me. What does that actually mean in practice?
In the context of artificial intelligence, researchers found that if they just let a large language model generate text freely, it produces unchecked, highly persuasive rhetoric. It hallucinates beautifully.
Because it has no brakes.
Exactly. But if they design software architectures that force the LLM to pause, to detect inconsistencies in its own logic, to explicitly justify its claims with physical evidence, or to critique its own proposals before outputting them, the final text becomes much more grounded in reality.
They add speed bumps.
They literally introduce friction like adding speed bumps to a sports car to slow down the generation of persuasive nonsense.
And we, as human consumers of information, have to do exactly that. We have to apply epistemic friction to the authoritative claims we hear every single day. We cannot accept linguistic fluency or an institutional logo as proof of reality.
You have to be your own speed bump.
When a politician or a health official stands at a podium and declares, "The science is settled," that is your immediate cue to apply friction. Ask the Socratic questions. Based on what? Raw data. What were the confounding variables you ignored? What is the absolute risk reduction, not just the relative risk? Did you count the lives, or did you model a counterfactual?
Exactly. The antidote to modern, science-washed sophistry is fundamentally unchanged from the days of Socrates in the Athenian square. It is a stubborn, fearless commitment to questioning the narrative.
I love that.
It is a refusal to blindly accept the shadows projected on the cave wall, no matter how prestigious, how wealthy, or how authoritative the institution projecting them might be.
Wow. So to summarize our journey today, we started in ancient Athens, where merchants of persuasion sold the illusion of wisdom for profit and political power. We saw how those merchants evolved, donning the lab coats of modern epidemiology to hide deeply flawed methodologies like circular reasoning, false precision, and emotional manipulation behind the unassailable, unquestionable authority of science.
And we looked at how artificial intelligence is now perfectly reflecting and amplifying those very same human rhetorical tricks at light speed.
We have mapped the architecture of the illusion. I want to thank you for helping pull back the curtain on thousands of years of rhetorical manipulation.
It has been a vital, necessary conversation.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own, something that builds directly on that MBO report's paper about AI and epistemic friction.
Let's hear it.
For decades, our society has pushed our education system almost exclusively towards STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We have relentlessly defunded and minimized the humanities, treating philosophy, classical literature, and the study of rhetoric as useless, unprofitable relics of the past.
That's very true.
But think about this. As large language models become the ultimate digital sophists, as AI learns to perfectly mimic the structure of biological data and statistical certainty without possessing a single shred of actual physical understanding, the hard sciences are going to face an existential crisis of truth.
Because they won't know what's real.
Exactly. How will a peer reviewer know if a paper is real or just brilliantly hallucinated rhetoric? The only way for future scientists to survive this impending massive flood of machine-generated illusions might be to resurrect the ancient humanities.
Wow.
To save the integrity of hard science, we may literally have to go back to teaching our biochemists, our statisticians, and our epidemiologists the ancient arts of Socratic philosophy, formal logic, and rhetoric. We might need Socrates to save STEM.
That is a profound thought to end on.
So the next time you are handed a pristine, seemingly perfect diagnostic X-ray of the truth, whether it's from a politician on a screen, a prestigious medical journal, or an incredibly polite AI chatbot, remember that the image might just be a digital filter.
Remember the golden pigeon.
Stay curious, apply that epistemic friction, and keep questioning the narrative. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.